Random tangent here, but it's cold outside. Well, I don't really know what I would have expected aside from cold, it being November and all, but I digress. This was the latest episode of The Flash, and real quick, I think it was decent. There were some parts of it I really liked, some parts of it I really did not much care for. It really had me rolling my eyes at some points. But basically, the plot of this one, there's a new metahuman in town called Girder. He can basically turn his skin into this steel form, which renders him very nigh impregnable, almost invincible to the Flash's punches. This causes Barry to relive some of his childhood experiences with bullies, and it turns out that Girder is secretly someone who used to pick on him as a kid. Now, in addition, Joe West, Detective West, is just starting to run down a lead on who may have killed Barry's mother, the man in yellow, who fans will probably know as Reverse Flash or Professor Zoom. He goes to Dr. Wells with his suspicions, and towards the end of the episode gets a little warning. So right off the bat, I like how this episode really, again, stressed how these characters really have to go at their opponents with a little bit of strategy. With Oliver Queen, only rarely does he ever come up against someone who he cannot bring down. With the Flash, however, he is a rookie. He has little to no combat training. He's just very fast. So with each new opponent, he has to learn a little something new, which, again, differentiates it from Arrow in a lot of ways. Now, this one he actually learned to fight, which I actually thought was handled better than this week's episode of Gotham, where Bruce Wayne learned to fight. But, again, not talking about Gotham right now. Now, first of all, this actually provided not only some interesting opportunities for strategy, like I said, but also it finally gives Eddie something to do. Now, Eddie, up until this point, has been this, in my opinion, this very bland character. I know him as Eddie Thawne, aka Professor Zoom, but it doesn't look like he's going to be Professor Zoom in this show, but not to speculate too much. Eddie, up to this point, has just been this bland boyfriend character. He's just been the other guy. He hasn't been bad, and I don't blame Rick Cosnet for this, but they haven't really given him much to do at this point. Here, he actually goes on a case with Barry, the case of Girder, and not only do they talk about Iris and Eddie's thoughts going into the relationship with Iris, but also they actually, I don't want to say get into a bromance, but they actually learn a little bit about each other. Now, and in addition, they possibly gain some respect for each other. So, again, this provided some nice opportunities for Eddie. We got to hear a little bit about why he's this big, dashing guy who can seemingly do anything. He has engineered himself, or has built himself to this point. He used to be picked on. So that was actually an interesting little scene. And the fact that he gets to interact more with Barry this time around lended some nice character moments. There were still a few scenes where he was a little bland for my tastes, but for the most part, I thought this episode handled Eddie better than any prior episode thus far. He's an actual character here, not just a bit part who anyone can play. And in addition, the acting all across the board is still very good. Grant Gustin still kills it as Barry Allen. The supporting cast, like Carlos Valdez, I finally got his name right, as Cisco, and Danielle Panabaker as Caitlin, they're still a lot of fun. They still bounce off of each other. I still like the dynamic they have going with Barry. And we got some nice interaction between Jesse L. Martin and Tom Cavanaugh this time around. They're both very good. I liked where that part, or that little plot went. How we finally learn just what Dr. Wells was allegedly doing when Barry's mother was killed. So there's that, and also, spoiler, the little threat that Joe receives at the end, that actually could set up some interesting conflicts with does Joe sacrifice his duty to Barry, which, as far as he's concerned, is just like a paternal duty to Barry, and getting his father out of prison, does he put that or potentially sacrifice that to ensure Iris's safety? So that will provide some interesting dilemmas, hopefully. However, one of the weaknesses in this particular episode was the villain. Again, not that the villain was terrible. You still saw him as the bad guy. He still did evil things. But I actually recognize this guy. Greg Finley, I think his name is. He's the meathead from Starcrossed. And he's doing basically the exact same routine. I will give this to him. He's not nearly as bad as Kellen Lutz. He is pretty good at playing a dumb guy. I mean, he is pretty good at playing this big, dumb musclehead, but again, that doesn't really make for a particularly menacing villain. It just makes for some bully character, which I understand that was the point. But again, we are supposed to be genuinely afraid of this guy, and I was not afraid of this guy. He just seemed like a punk. Although maybe, again, they will step it up. I'm still sticking with this show. Again, we had Captain Cold, Wentworth Miller, who was menacing. I liked him. But Girder basically comes on to Iris. He basically starts hitting on her with all the subtlety of Biff Tannen. I wanted to call this guy Biff throughout the entire episode because he acted just like him, although Biff was funnier and more entertaining than this guy. But I digress. Point is, he wasn't a very good villain, and again, a recurring problem on this show. I'm starting to think this creative team doesn't... Whenever they try to make this actively strong female character, this very proactive female character, that just kind of backfires, because Iris is continuing to write this stupid blog about the streak, the red streak. And it gets her into trouble in this episode, and what does she do? Does she learn from her mistake? No, of course not. She goes right back to writing about the blog, and somehow Barry has to apologize to her for getting angry with her after overwriting the blog. I'm sorry. Shouldn't it be the other way around? Especially since it caused her to be abducted this episode. Granted, that wasn't Girder's only motivation for abducting her. Again, he had the hots for her. Again, Biff Tannen here, Biff Tannen logic. But again, you think after an experience as traumatic as this, or potentially as traumatic as this, she would actually learn her lesson. But no, she goes right back to writing the blog like a moron. Again, it really bothered me. So the villain and basically anything having to do with Iris, I was just rolling my eyes. And just to talk about Iris for 1 second, I don't hate her nearly as much as I hate Laurel. At least Iris, for the time being anyway, she has her life together. She occasionally gets a good line. She's at least a little bit more responsible than Laurel. Laurel basically blames everyone else for her problems. I'm not going to go into why I hate Laurel now. It could go on for more than a minute, which I don't want to waste an entire minute of this. Point is, I liked the episode okay. The action scenes were good. I like how they are continually implementing new strategies for these villains, for taking down these villains. The dynamic between a lot of the characters still really works. Showing the Flash actually losing a fight was pretty effective, or two fights actually. However, another problem I have with this episode, did it really have to be the same guy? Did Girder, Tony, I believe his real name was, did Tony have to be the same exact guy who picked on Barry as a kid? It's really stretches how far I can suspend my disbelief at this huge coincidence, and B, it's unnecessary. You can still have Barry feel the sense of powerlessness that comes with being bullied without it being the same guy. You can still have that. I mean, you could even harken back to him being bullied in school, but again, it doesn't have to be the same guy. You could still go through this personal journey of being dominated by someone bigger than you without necessarily having thrown in this huge coincidence, this completely unbelievable coincidence. You could still draw parallels to that. Barry even says, I've known people like you, peaked in high school, bully, bully, bully. So, you could still do that. But again, the fact that they felt the need to make it the same guy, it seemed very on the nose and almost condescending in a way, how they didn't think audiences would be able to draw this comparison. But yeah, that did not work for me. The point is, this was a decent episode with some flaws. Again, I like the characterization they gave Eddie. I like the dynamic between the characters. The action scenes were still good. I like how they're not necessarily making the Flash invincible, this very overpowered, speedy character who just can never be hit. He does lose occasionally, especially since someone who is physically stronger than him. Although another thing, this really, I'm kind of finding flaws with this episode the more I go about it. Revealing his identity to the guy, the bully at the end, was a pretty stupid move on your part, Barry. In comic books and comic book media in general, prisons, super prisons included, are just made to be broken out of. So what happens when this guy eventually gets out and exploits his knowledge of your identity? So again, flaws, particularly with the villain and with the Iris. Everything else was good.